I'm Z. Did you have a sequence of questions to get started?
Yes. Basically, what basically brought you down? Actually, yeah. Well, firstly, just a bit of a background into who you are, maybe a bit about what you do or what you feel comfortable sharing with, and also, what's kind of brought you down to the path of life that you walk currently. So basically, just how you go about your business and what you're pursuing in this life currently.
It's a broad question.
Can simplify it, maybe just a basic introduction about yourself. Something, what is it that you enjoy doing? What is it that you're doing currently? And what's kind of motivating you behind what you do currently, if that's okay enough.
I currently, there's a couple tracks, several. My heart is that I'm a musician.
Okay.
Playing music, the very least I could say formally, since I was 3 years old. I walked up to a piano, and I vaguely remember this myself, but I was told, actually, I remember it pretty well. And it was after a worship service when I was 3. I walked up to a piano and I just began playing. Well, and some of the adults were surprised and then more shocked when my mom said nobody's thought maybe he's depressed some keys on a little organ at his grandparents' house.
Mm-hmm.
And that was the beginning. So I can only assume that was probably banging toys around in more of a coherent manner than most children, or singing, or just expressing musical aptitude. So I'd say our reality in both terms of mathematics and internality is frequency.
Mm-hmm.
As we can hear harmonies and expression, I'd say I'm a musician.
Okay, wow.
I've taken deeply to farming. I've been farming since also I was a child. And about 8 years ago, maybe, and I really got back into farming myself proactively as an adult, looking into all the effects of organics and the procedures, and a lot of close people with me now who have been more trained in horticulture, herbology, etc. Mycelium, mushroom people,
Nice.
A lot of good people working with. So that kind of moves into a big thing that we're working with, which is building communities.
Mm-hmm.
And we're picking up land and gathering people at the land in these communities to do large-scale farming for subsistence for the group. Not really.
That's really. I was actually sorry if I get into. I actually find that's really amazing. I have noticed now there's a growing trend of people who are kind of returning to the ancestral way of life, almost as if the city way, the industrial way that we're living with all these toxins and pollutants and everything, it's kind of creating a shift from people to return back towards cultivating their land. Like you said, through things like regenerative farming, there's a whole bunch of other things. I know I forgot the specific term for it, but it's when you use the layout of the land to basically create an ecosystem around it. I forgot, there's a fancy word for it. I don't know if you can maybe jog my mind. There's a specific word for this type of farming, but it's actually really, 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 I think it may even be coinciding with what you're doing currently.
There's been a radical departure from sensibility, and sociologically we could look at it. The most standout point might be the Industrial Revolution, so-called, but you could look back further, even considering in the conventional look at time, history. I reject it outright, but the way people have been programmed to receive the idea.
Mm-hmm.
Backstory, if you will, is that the emergence of cities from agriculture, from more primitive living, that might not be quite the linear way we're used to believing that event moves to event, but using the more conventional standard, we could start there. Definitely look at the Renaissance, Enlightenment period, till the Industrial Revolution, into the 1920s, the 1950s for sure, and that's probably the most radical departure point is the 1950s and the peak of
I'm not
the
sure.
apex of society, classical society, according to some. At least I'm definitely speaking from an American perspective. I apologize. That's some of these things are more worldwide, but narrowing into the 50s in America was kind of the apex of the life here. And I realized you're out of Johannesburg in South Africa, and we have probably a wide variety of British speaking, British cultural individuals watching as well. But as far as the America is concerned, they do kind of set a trend for Western countries in general, at least the social zeitgeist. There was a apex around the 50s. We get the 60s, and we've suddenly come into dynamically different territory, because now there's, one single thing really renovated the social landscape, which was this introduction of the birth control pill, and suddenly of the summer of love. And a lot of modern mind about it is not acknowledging that there wasn't just a gestalt of change of mind and people suddenly were awakened. And now, as they introduced the birth control pill, which goes back to Nazi, the World War II era, and really started with all these Nazi things, genuinely started between the 1890s and the 1930s in the United States. It was a very particular group of individuals who was pioneering these things. They realized it would not be dealt with well by the American public, wouldn't be shouldered if it was unveiled what was going on. So this stuff got shipped to Nazi Germany and continued there. So a lot of individuals erroneously believed that this began there, and it really didn't. It was individuals who were maybe part of what could later be called the Oxford Group and the like, which really was had its foothold in the United States and got shipped back to Germany. Many of those who were here in 1890, like the Gellers, these bankers and these particular families of origin, came to the States. It may go deeper, but you might not want to go that deep now. But that's definitely the topical stuff that can be said. And as the 60s forward, we've definitely got very far away from, as the young folks say today, touching grass. And more and more through the 70s, we departed into a modernization, got all the radical technology beginnings we have now. Probably started more in intelligence agency think tanks in the 60s, even into the 50s. Some would say mid 40s, but definitely came to the public side in the 70s. We had computers the size of a house. Recently, for what it's worth, I was just sitting at a dinner. I actually met a man named Moshe Mazin, who is the individual who holds all the tech patents for IBM, who consolidated those household-sized computers, the computers the size of a house, to the desktop. He's the man who did the tech patents. So we were just privilege of meeting him and speaking with him about 2 weeks ago. So just a note there. That was a moment.
Wow, no. Talk about coincidences.
Yeah. Well, we went into the 80s with people used to know how to say phrases correctly too, because now people say, that's not a coincidence. Well, it is a coincidence, or you wouldn't be talking about the interestingness of the juxtaposition of two things. The correct grammar was, formulation was, it's not just a coincidence. Obviously, these things are coincidental, or you wouldn't be talking about the two things connecting.
Mm-hmm.
We used to notice it's not just a coincidence. It's one of my pet peeves. People say that can't be a coincidence. Well, it is a coincidence. That's why you're describing two things that seem unusually connected. It's not just a coincidence.
Yeah. No, I hear you. I hear you.
Yeah. So that was of note. And then we move into the 80s with the desktop and get, for those old enough to remember, in the 90s, the big deal is that we got this encyclopedia
Mm-hmm.
that everybody had on CD-ROM, and then obviously the internet came out and they were working on that around 95. And that was the original part, played through DARPA, and then the early versions of CERN and what they're doing in Italy and back here in the States. And so we move into the 2000 era that we're still in now. Obviously, we'll be for a while, and allegedly. And, we have Y2K, and I'm a firm believer Y2K happened. And one of the reasons is because I was standing on a balcony in B'nai B'rith, Tel Aviv, and I knew what was going to happen, and I watched it happen. And I watched people sort of not realize it the next day that it had happened. And it didn't have the temporal effect or the topical effect in the regular world. Seemed to say, well, it felt like this internal computer glitch was going to be a much bigger deal. And we seem to have been talking about it or making patch codes for it and the whatnot since the 80s and 90s. We were very prepared for this, and it seems like we went through it smoothly. Well, no, something did happen, and it wasn't what people anticipated. Some people anticipated what happened, but and obviously now the last 23 years have been a brave new world, and there have been some definite inflection points: 9/11, 2003, back into the Middle East. I mean, these things are not just the things themselves; they had greater social impact and etheric impact, if you want to go there. And they kept moving this game board, this machine forward. 2008 with the collapse, and into at least social unrest. There really probably wasn't that much energetically or etherically that changed in 2012, because that might have been a lie. But it did seem to in 2015, for anybody who was paying attention, in 2017 and 2019. And it wasn't just a phenomenon of odd numbers. But there was a steady march from 2015 to 2019 in the launching of a worldwide sense of change that probably post a world after what happened in March of 2020, February of 2020. And we're still figuring out what that means. I know it took a whole lot of energy, and I mean that in every dynamic sense, to achieve you and I talking, because there's a thing that could maybe simply be called time dilation. The value, some people know this, the value of a dollar isn't what a dollar used to be. You hear older people say that all constantly, but it's a little more said that the value of a minute
is not what it used to be. Oh, the signal here keeps on cutting out. Sorry, I don't know why it keeps on. The signal is a bit tricky here. Let me get into a good position. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. So we actually went through quite a spectrum there. There was a whole lot, and there was a whole lot. Yeah. So I need to re-centralize it, because you brought out a lot of interesting points, and this is actually one of the main things I actually wanted to ask you is, what is, because ultimately everything we talk about is in a spiritual context, ultimately, or at least that's what I would assume. I believe myself. Maybe I could be wrong, and you can correct me. But I was going to ask you is, what is spirituality in your definition? More specifically, what has spirituality become within your experience? I mean, ultimately, that's where most people can only answer from what they've come to experience through themselves, right? So I don't know if that was specific enough, or you want me to maybe go in deeper. But yeah, the basic foundation of it is, what is spirituality in your definition?
No, I don't mean to be disruptive to the question. And I understand the question. I appreciate its trajectory. However, I take umbrage with their code. And that is because I don't believe we have any anymore.
Mm-hmm. No, it's on my laptop of all places. It's being
You're fine.
it's completely being odd. I don't know why. I just don't know why it's doing it. A whole lot of different things. But I saw I cut you up there, and you were literally
Yes. Well,
go
I
ahead.
take umbrage with the word spirituality is that we have effectively destroyed the spiritual world. We then proceeded forward and we destroyed what could be called the pure energy world, the world of energy. And now we exist presently in a world that is two-tiered.
Mm-hmm.
And that is that we currently experience ourselves in the material world. We often use a synonym to that, which I take umbrage with, of the physical. Now, the physical is used wrong because the two tiers that we have are material and physical.
Yes.
Material is obvious. We live in a world full of matter,
Mm-hmm.
but we've been conditioned with a lie that we take for granted of using this word physical as a physical object. It's a material object. Our vernacular is terrible and misleads our mind. So the world of mind is a synonym for physical. So a strand of synonyms to make sense of the second tier. So you have this ground tier, this ground level tier, this base level, the material world. We all understand what that means.
Mm-hmm.
We all understand what that means. You can pick up any object that's made, it's matter. It's in the form of matter. We can pick it up, we can move it around. It has the definition, in my way of expressing, of the number one. Every object, every stick works with Arabic numeral cultures, like who speak English. We're using Arabic numerals. One looks like a stick. Usually the rune isn't too far from that or has some sticks in. That's irrelevant. The point is, everybody knows we have objects. They're in matter. They're in the form of matter, and they're expressed as the number one. They're a one, an object. Whereas physical is a synonym for mental, unseen, mind, maybe akasha.
Akashic
We have these different words, but quite simply put, in a more accessible metric universally would be to say that it parallels the world of phenotype and genotype. Genotype is a code. It encodes what is the phenomena, if you will, and then the phenotype is what's observed. Or you could say where you code a web page, and then you see the web page. So the world of the mental world, the invisible world, the unseen world is what we're calling the spiritual world. It's very real. So I don't mean to disrupt your question, because your question is an apt question. I just take umbrage with our vernacular, because we're calling the mental world the spiritual world. And technically it's not.
No.
It is, however, unseen, networked, and very real, and not too hard to access scientifically, to grasp, like mycelium. Using, Nikola Tesla said, if you approach the world, this world, the mental world, through the lens of frequency and electricity, you'll understand simply the realness. So we all have cell phones now. Technology, sometimes it functions well, sometimes it doesn't. But I remember when I received my first little brick cell phone, and I looked at people who had been looking at me incredulously, and I said, you have no problem with the fact that this little device in your pocket, you can pull it out and you can make a little text, because that's almost all you could do back then, except maybe play Snake, and push send, and it goes to a tower far away, and you're standing next to me, and it can shoot a signal back to your little box in your pocket that you're maybe playing Snake on. But you don't believe these can
interface with the same principles that the devices themselves use.
Your intuitive grasp of a thing is that limited, and then your scientific ability to realize the electrofrequency components of this body, its glandular makeup is so limited. You don't realize you're dealing with electromagnetic frequencies between our heart, our lungs, our brain, primarily our heart and our lungs and our brain. And honestly, there's something going on in the alveoli of the lungs, the little sacs inside the lungs. They're more convoluted, meaning they're more tightly wrapped than even the gray matter of the brain. Wow. So in the occult literature, they're considered the high heart. So you can start to, so my background academically is that I have equivalency degree of quantum mechanics as applied biology over in Tel Aviv. So we're looking at the systems of the body on a quantum mechanical level. So in that effect, you see that the alveoli of the lungs are technically what's called a microtubule wormhole. They're an Einstein-Rosen bridge. So essentially that means that information can come through on electromagnetic spectrum through breathing, through using the little organelles, the alveoli in the lungs, in such a way that it can update telomeres, it can update allele sequences, it can improve genetic code. You're not necessarily such a static organism. You know, we have static physics, in quotes, physics from Newtonian physics, and then we went, oh, that's not bound to those limitations. They were our solipsistic perception orientation limitations. That, well, it's bigger than that. And then we find out maybe our bodies. So we're assigning something that we often call spirituality, or the spiritual, which I know we began as being there, but we had an issue. And during that, we eroded and destroyed that level. We came down to the world of pure energy, and we destroyed that level. And now we exist on a two-tiered system. What we're calling spiritual is what the occult literature might simply call the mental. The mental is really powerful, and it speaks to the straight, direct question you've asked. So this interconnectivity web is a web of mental electromagnetics, mostly electromagnetics, more forces involved, but primarily electromagnetic frequency. So we're sending, literally, with these apparatus in ourselves, we're sending a signal. It's not that deep, honestly, to really understand and grasp what pure energy is, the world of pure energy, the world of real spirit, is unattained by 99% of seekers, not even 99% of people. It's unattained by 99% of seekers. However, those who seek, whether they're standing in an evangelical church on a Sunday and they're reaching out for the Holy Ghost, the Holy Spirit, there is a field that is highly accessible to an individual when they use the apparatus they have in their body. And it's an electromagnetic frequency, no matter what name they put on it. If they're accessing this field, which is the most universal way to call it, you know, I use some different ways, but it's a field. It's a field of electromagnetic energy, and it's just as real as sending a message through the interwebs or through the cellular device. It's just as real because we're conducing electromagnetic. So we say spirituality. I believe what we're dealing with is hardware that has the ability to use an electromagnetic frequency network, and software that we might call the local and temporal mind that gets built up, again, as a culture of energies and forces. Again, we're not talking about pure energy because that's kind of something else, but we talk about energy loosely as a net equation effect of cofactors and forces that are coming together, and simplified down to electromagnetics, that we're cultivating something called the mind. And in that, we're really dealing with, and I promise you, nobody really wants to hear me. Nobody wants to face me, because the direct thing that I'm going to say is what they're calling spirituality is a lie. We're dealing with psychology. And what most people don't want to understand is to come to maturity in what we could call psychic hygiene, or dealing with the cleaning of the psyche, because we're dealing with the level of mind, we're dealing with the level of the psyche. That's not to diminish or reduce it, because it's quite powerful, and it comes into the aspects of what people generally refer to as magic, the occult, and occultare in Latin. The word simply means hidden, unseen. Esoteric in Greek, the unseen. The unseen is the mind. not per se the brain. We have these apparatus, primarily the brain, the lungs, the heart, that are moving forces. You got the gut, the centers of the body, the major centers that are given these fancy names and chakras or spiras, and the Hindu and Vedantic system, or the Kabbalistic system that comes through, and it takes its own shape, say in Sufi Islam, and it takes its different shapes through these different traditions, and the deeper mystical Catholic traditions have their way of, but they're dealing with this. They're all talking about something we can all relate to, which are the centers of the body that are doing an actual apparatus scientific look at thing. We're deep breathing. Now we're expanding our diaphragm. So expanding our diaphragm starts moving lymphatic fluid through the body correctly. The heart's moving blood if you're healthy automatically, but the lymphatic system isn't moving so well. It doesn't have an automatic pump. The pump is how well are you using your diaphragm. Now you start using your diaphragm, deep breathing, that's going on. Now your neurotransmitters are hormonally moving better through your body. You're activating the system in the lungs. You're taking deep. So there are many things that are going on that are actually just bodily systems that affect the sensations and impressions that are going to the brain, and thus through a lot of this is visual, the occipital lobe in the back. We're dealing with ocular stuff. Now the corpus callosum is presenting a movie. How clean is the movie? How clear is the channel? But we're dealing with mental apparatus that formulate the mind, and we're calling this spirituality. Many don't even have a very good clue how to organize and work with this system called the mind. Maybe if we started to realize that that's all we're really doing, it's not woo-woo, it's just a system of hidden psychology, which is what these ancient so-called wisdom systems were really dealing with, is having access manuals to operate the computer, both on a software level. I don't believe I said it, I got close, saying the mind is the software level, and then we've got these parts, these systems that are the hardware level. Now, as soon as we realize that we're not doing anything that out there, anything that deep, then individuals don't need to go into this overcompensating mode where they're like trying to use moods, atmosphere, and expression of how spiritual they are because they're moving into their right brain, they're perfuming it around, they're attempting to get it out there. I'm not like you, I'm not mundane, but it's an immaturity. And I understand the need to say, I'm on something, I'm doing a thing, I'm moving into a space, but they lack the maturity to realize, no, you're just using your mind at an advanced level. You're not anywhere near anything genuinely able to be called spirit. You don't understand what that would do to you or what that would be for you. But it's beautiful that you're enhancing your mind and learning about. So I'm not here to take anything away from accessing that level because it's super powerful. And the more we learn the talents and the longitude and breadth of this system called the mind, I mean, there's a vast ocean to swim in of capabilities of this thing, and we're only beginning to tie back to where I was when I said a minute, the value of a minute. Well, it's an interesting thing. People got these sort of pensive pools to make a cult, but yet used as a Nicholas Flamel, what's the Fulcanelli. The actual man's name is Fulcanelli. A student, Eugene Castanel, wrote the book, The History of the Great Cathedrals of Europe. And allegedly this came down as J.K. rolling a napkin in a coffee shop. That's fabrication. That's the polished publicity version. The reality is a man named a high adept who only called himself Fulcanelli in Italy was giving over transmission to a student named Eugene Castanel, and he wrote the Great Cathedrals of Europe. And that's where all this inspiration came to J.K. Rowling. It wasn't her own, and it didn't involve genuinely a napkin in a coffee shop, but that's good. That's a good publicity.
Yeah,
that narrative, sells more cookies. But in there, they mention the pensive. I mean, we got these little, Dumbledore pensives in their hand, their extra brain, the smartphone, like an immersive field. You could add a little. Now, something interesting started happening, and people loosely call this the Mandela effect. I don't particularly care for the name. We call them edits or whatnot, but there is a quantum field. So now you've got everybody's distortion of their poor education, ignorance, reshaping maps. is a phenomena for those who had an absolute knowledge of maps like I did to realize that the actual land, this is a little much for some people, but when we realize we're in a quantum magnetic field, you gave everybody these devices to project their perception of things like land and boundaries at you. And we started seeing why, if you were really paying attention, we genuinely saw an objective observation. We saw wild things happening, things that people remember, and it's not misremembering. There's a whole Reddit community who wants to say all of this is misremembering. Well, listen, loads of this is just nonsense. Loads of it's nonsense, and people misremembering, or people who generally can't even remember what they ate for breakfast yesterday. I'm not talking about people living in that state of unattentivity, but there are vigilant people who really genuinely remember things, and there are nuanced effects to the steps and the increments of going, no, that authentically changed. But I'm suggesting that there's a way.
I hate to pause you there, but we have 3 minutes left before this meeting ends. So I need.
Well, I can tie this up in this, that we have a way that we see that this is a use of this is going on, a phenomenon maybe. So one aspect of it, big factor of it, is people having these devices and affecting the field of what is in the observable world through their mind's confusion about what it is. We actually augmented it to a point of resolve. Okay, it's going to be like this. We tie that back now to what we experience going on, loosely coined or termed time dilation. So now nobody's quite sure where the point of orientation or a fixed value is in the world. So we're altering the sensation of a minute. What's your minute feel like? What's her minute feel like? So it took you and I a long while to get here, and the forces that are out there, these interrupting obstacles, they don't really come at me in this grand way of grandeur. It's more like pesky. It's like this blunt force trauma, like, oh, now this thing and this little thing. Your computer now needs 1 hour of updates. And maybe the time zones keep dyslexically, it took a lot to be here. So I'm attempting to keep it at a 3rd grade level of explanation, but hopefully we've begun.
No,
and I know we've trailed this through me back to my pseudo intro, and then bringing it back around to communities and farming and land, and moving through our social maneuvering. And now we see at least there's a social zeitgeist of coming back to our roots, coming back to the grass, wanting to not pretend that tomatoes grow on a grocery store shelf, seeing a process through whatever it is, and understanding our stages.
I completely actually understand where you're coming from on that one. And honestly, I don't know, because I actually had quite a few more questions, but I know that with timing, all good to go, Z. So we left off at quite a interesting point. You basically redefined the concept of spirituality. Basically, you alluded to our current interpretation or experience of it as basically the construct of the mind itself, how it operates and how it interfaces with the subtle nature of existence that is running things, or at least that we're basically a part of, and that is building the construct that we live in. I was going to ask you then, how does one bridge the gap in understanding between East and West? And I know it's a kind of, basically after what you explained initially, it basically doesn't, really matter in the grand scheme of things. But I think it is maybe important for those that do tune in. Each way, like both the East and West have all defined their understanding of spirituality, and then you find it as something. So how does one harmonize that duality? Basically, that's what I want to ask. How do you harmonize the duality between two different perceptions or understanding or cultivating of the mind? If I could maybe explain it that way, how would you harmonize that duality to create more mental stability, rather than, because I think part of reaching, I guess, clarity that you mentioned, cleaning up the mental vacuum, you can have conflicting thoughts. Even though we live in a conflicting universe, those thoughts should exist harmoniously some way, somehow. They have to be, they have to be mutually exclusive and inclusive at the same time. I don't know if I explained that right, but yeah, I'll hand it over to you.
Brilliant. So I'm going to finish with your original two, bring it through to this. So I was on the track of saying there's a multitude of things currently that are my current activities. And that was speaking to building these communities as a big task we're working on. But we couldn't be working on that without exposing people to the common law, irrevocable ecclesiastical trust. So we teach people about trust law in this regard. And I'm speaking technically from knowledge I have about the United States of America, but I can explain in pieces how this is the scenario for every so-called alleged, because they are merely alleged countries of the world. And you look classically, we have a bracket that could be stretched much older, but it begins in classical exposition from Babylon to Persia to Greece to Rome, and by extension to the Catholic Vatican, and then from there to the financial district of London in the UK, and eventually the United States of America by colonial victory. And even though there's a multitude of more antiquous cultures, there's a through line here which has to do with finance and who has this hegemony on the world. And that's come down through the Babylon bankers to them being conquered by the Persians, and then the Greeks, and then eventually the Romans, and how this becomes a formal declared statement of, I believe, Pope Innocent II, that the Catholic Church owned all souls. So this is a fascinatingly wild claim, but it has more fiscal application than it sounds as though it has ephemeral value. It has fiscal ramifications, and that's the part that sometimes evades people's realization. This is a fiscal statement. Why so much of the paperwork and documentation around birth and death deals with this pseudo-religious interest of whose team are you on? Because we're really looking at a fiscal reality that moved from the Vatican by way of being in Italy, and the protectorate of Italy was Spain. They were working closely together. So what's often not seen is that the British victory over the Spanish Armada had much bigger implications than just a military victory. It was that they beat them at sea, which is a maritime region, which is about finance. And the World Maritime Law, Universal Commerce Code comes off of maritime law. These are aspects that deal with finance and fiscal reality, because on the land, it's really common law, but it gets skewed by a sort of legal fiction that imposes itself over the land, which deals with what they've termed maritime law. Pirates are a funny aspect of this we can leave out for now, but I did say them there, so they're embedded. And why what they were really doing out there, marauding. The marauding may have had a bigger context, but in direct terms of this through line, this mainstream through line of the world, the Armada is conquered by the British Navy, so that's at sea. So they have maritime dominance now through Spain as the protectorate of Italy, Rome, the Vatican. The Vatican, as the financial power of the world, now transfers to the financial district of London. And that runs the world for a while. And its forays into Asia become intriguing and have play in this as well. But eventually, what's not realized is that the Revolutionary War in the Americas, besting the British, meant that they took fiscal power over the world. Now we see this happen in the world, but may not realize that there's a fiscal item going on. And again, what evades many people's knowledge is that it's sort of the equivalent of people not realizing that people's minds didn't suddenly progress and birth the the love child of the 60s. That was because they were given the birth control pill. Similarly, a bunch of well-meaning, zealous, and passionate colonists did not defeat the greatest empire in the world with their ambition.
Mm-hmm.
They were heavily funded by the Chinese royal family who now resides in Taiwan and buried all their gold under Taiwan, not the current and any kind of former adjacent current Chinese communist regime. Talking about in the 1700s, you were still dealing with the Chinese royal family who had to retreat to Taiwan. That gets into more geopolitics presently. The people don't always get the implications of, which aren't so far back, but they're back far enough that nobody really is remembering what was the most popular song on TikTok last week. But looking at this from this perspective, you have to realize that the Chinese royals had an interest in the Americans beating the British.
Mm-hmm.
And they did because they were heavily funded by them. That's where they got all their guns. And, this is a little more nuanced than we get, traditionally taught. And that's interesting for a gold-backed standard, understanding why China's currently so, why we're indebted, but we don't realize maybe some more of what's going on here. There's bigger things afoot. That being said, that has to do with grasping that something was made in 1776, and I'll keep it brief because we can talk about all these topics in the future if you want or later, but there was it's put like this: you hold up an American dollar bill and they want you to be misled by the United States of America. And then they put the real agency underneath in smaller letters. It's the "In God We." So the American dollar says "In God We Trust." Now, that's not a slogan, but you're supposed to believe it is as part of the so-called temporal matrix. I'm not even getting into the etheric matrix, but the matrix of society and ideas, you're supposed to buy into the fact that says something kind of like, in a higher power, we have faith. So some sort of a generic slogan about hold that this nation is supported by this
God.
higher power. And that's not at all what that says. So it's missed by most people, but dollar bills, promissory notes, these green ones we have here in America, these are publicly traded. We don't always look at it that way because it's not a stock or something you would consider a publicly traded item, but they're actually the most. We literally do the exchange.
Literally with each dollar transaction.
So attempt to put this succinctly. There in Universal Commerce Code, there's some things you can't do. You can't call something which isn't a bank under any circumstance. So if you wanted to be strange, let's say you were very strange, you were a weird individual, and you wanted to start up Mufaro's nursery school salon. By the laws of commerce, nobody's going to stop you. And if you aren't doing nails and hair, you also aren't getting students, and you're going to go out of business because that's creepy, and nobody's sending you their child. But nobody's going to stop you from this odd combination. However, if you wanted to have Mufaro's nursery school bank, you would not be allowed because you cannot call something a bank which isn't a bank. You will be stopped. You can't do it. Similarly, you can't have a publicly traded offering with the word trust that doesn't allude to a financial trust. You may not do it. It's not done. So that was the key tip-off hint to the individual who figured this out or who leaked it, because I'm sure, as he said himself, that many accountants before himself saw this, but they didn't have the fortitude to come forward and speak out. Well, the moment of astonishment, oh, wait, Black's Law Dictionary, you can't put the word trust on a financial instrument that's a publicly traded offering without a so here in the States, it's pretty common knowledge that stocks are recorded at Wall Street, that the words Wall Street and stocks, they go hand in hand. Well, so too, trust and Dun & Bradstreet go hand in hand. Dun & Bradstreet is, it's both a place formally, and so you can go online, just like you can go online to Wall Street and check it up. Well, it finds out in 1776, a bunch of individuals conglomerated together and they made a trust. They made an actual trust. So we have a zeitgeist going around more and more people are aware of it, which also waters down a thing for at least 15 years. That it's become pretty popular in the YouTube era of the sovereignty, but sovereignty is a misnomer, it's misleading, and it's misinformed, and it misses the point, and they didn't get all the information, they can lead people astray. But this is, it's pretty easily provable. I have a delay. I'm not sure if I'm coming well for you.
No, I can, 100% no delay whatsoever this side.
Really good. Great. Super. Great. So that is to say, a trust is formulated by three parts, and those three parts correspond to the three officers. Every trust. And there's a declaration, which is, so that corresponds to the office of the grantor. So you decide, I want this trust to exist, this financial vehicle, this financial organization to exist. So you become the grantor. You're going to grant it into existence. You're going to declare it. So the grantor governs there being a declaration of trust. Then there's the trustees. Obviously, they run the trust according to the corpus, the body, what it is and what it does and governs and has province over. So you say that's the Constitution.
Mm-hmm.
So Americans clearly quickly hear the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution of the United States of America. These are the emblematic items, the icons of trust.
Trust.
So the only varying component is how you will assign the beneficiary. So let's say a standard model. Grandma makes a trust. What can you put in there? Vehicles, property, land, or money, usually. Maybe material assets. You have a high value or just sentimental train collection, model train, as it may be. So whatever there is, you put it in this container, this fiscal container called the trust. Now, typically, when the individual comes of age, whatever that is in country, 18, whatever, they would receive, as a individual of majority, they would receive the assets in the trust. If they're the beneficiary, they will benefit from these assets after the individual who made the trust deceases, and that individual comes of age, of majority, whatever that is.
Mm-hmm.
Now, so that is for any trust, there's the process of how you assign a beneficiary.
Mm-hmm.
They decided their process was going to be the birth certification process, and that's actually not what it's alleged to be. It's actually recording the individual as a beneficiary here of the in God we trust.
Mm-hmm.
Not in this higher power we have faith. No, it's the in God we. The organization is called the in God we trust.
Mm-hmm.
So what they've done is they put everybody in their trust organization as a beneficiary, and they call them citizens, but they're beneficiaries of the in God we, effectively rendering them retarded minor adult children for life because they will never inherit. The reason being is because there is an unbroken series of successor trustees, the legal fiction whereby you say as soon as trustee A deceases, instantly, as if retroactively, immediately upon death, trustee B and the trustee, P, trustee R in the backdrop is immediately appointed. They die immediately appointed as if there was no gap. So there is an unbroken handing off of the torch of successor trustees. Now, if you don't believe this, you can look it up. These guys still have it. They took an office at 78 Siebert Street in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Now, U.S. individuals will understand that the capital of the United States during colonial times was Philadelphia before they moved it over to Washington, D.C. much later. And so there's still this remnants. You have 78 Siebert Street, Philadelphia, under Woodrow Wilson, as like people like to redo their wedding vows. This was refied. They reaffirmed, and redid the re-signing of the In God We Trust. So there's no such thing as citizens. There's no such thing as countries. Slowing down, you can only be a managing steward of effects like vehicles, the aforementioned vehicles, property, So put buildings, vehicles, buildings. I mean, what do we really have here? Vehicles, buildings, land, money, material objects. That's it. You can only be a managing steward of those things. We are conditioned to believe you can own them. You cannot own those things. So everything that applies fundamentally to a group, there's no special privileges granted to a group. Every real privilege that's real in reality is vested in the individual. So if I can't do something, then no amount of individuals in a building writing paperwork and assigning their assigns of our paperwork and our influence to a bunch of tanks and guns, which gets into a deeper psychological or so-called spiritual fundamental etheric principles of our world. There's ability, and then there's allowance. There's what we're allowed to do in terms of, but then there's genuine free will, which means we have a wide berth of ability. The human condition is that the human can do anything the human can do. Most of it you should not do. Or taking the so-called golden rule, we've heard it mostly from a Christian voice. What you like done to you, do to others. Well, that's dumb. No offense, but there's a much stronger way you could say it. Because we're much more apt to justify, well, I'd probably like that because I want to do it to Bob or Shelley. But there's a better way. They say it in the apophatic. That which you really, really strongly dislike, you don't do that stuff to somebody else. That's actually in the Torah, that's an adage from the rabbis. They actually opted to say it in the more pleasant form as well in the final draft, but we kept the version of the guy who said, psychologically it cuts a little deeper if you say, hey, that stuff you hate when it really grinds your gears when people do it to you? Yeah, don't do that. Like you start saying that to your 2-year-old and your 3-year-old and 4-year-old when they have the 1-year-old and 2-year-old sibling. That stuff that really bothers you. Don't do that to your sister.
No, it's interesting that you mentioned that asset. Actually, that's the one I remember, is if you don't like something being done to you.
Because we all really know what we don't like.
Yeah.
One little thing you do with children gently, right? The sibling who's now 2, 3, 4, or 5, and they're pulling the tiny little news hair. You just remind them a little bit. Ow! Yeah. Oh, that hurts, little Susie sister. Yeah. Don't do that. You don't like how that then. Oh, she has face in here. Oh. Yeah. So anyway, before Liz, if everybody applied that everywhere, we'd be very far along as a species. But moving back to understanding this aspect of the trust. So what they did here is they effectively, okay, I know what I'm saying. So the point being that we have managerial stewardship. So we're misled to seeing this as ownership, but ownership takes 2 C words. Ownership fundamentally requires consent. That one's a little more obvious, and then contract. Now, I'm not going to go into the holistic full scale of you sit for a while, you'll realize why these things fundamentally need to be, which means you could tell me you're purely psychic and you want to own this piece of land, and you're John, for those who are older, John Travolta, Tremors, whatever, and you yes, I got the confirmation from the land. It said I may own it. Okay, can you get it to pick up a pen, please, and sign the written contract? Because that has more power than anything verbal here. Oh, you can't, because it can't do that, can it?
Yeah. No.
Okay, so maybe you theoretically got consent. Can't tell you one way or the other. I don't know, but you didn't get contract. So therefore, that rules out for land, property, aka buildings, vehicles, money, and material objects. You can't get contract from them, and you probably aren't getting consent either, if we're being honest. So that brings us to some very, very sketchy territory. We realize there's only actually one thing you can own in the world. And I'm going to qualify and preface with that. Don't do it. Do not be owned and do not own. But the only thing that you have the ability to, because you know what? You're not allowed to. You're fundamentally in natural law. You're not allowed to do this. But by the dynamics involved, You have the ability. But I'm strongly prefacing, do not be owned and do not own this product. But you can, and that's a human being. Because a human being can consent and contract. We're the only thing that can contract away our natural state of being ourself. And so that's the trick. You're just registering for your country. Now you're signing a birth certificate, but there's an unbroken series of successor trustees. Effectively, that puts you in the organization, but you have no power in the organization. So when I start speaking of this work, usually to people I meet, I say, here in our system, I say, police officer pulls you over. Does he have jurisdiction over you or the place you are at? Common conditioning is place you are at. Police officers programming, I have jurisdiction over New York City, over Johannesburg, wherever. I have jurisdiction over this locality. That is a fable. He has actual jurisdiction over you so long as you are in that contract that functions now pretty universally across the world, and it began pretty much here, of the birth certification, because that's actually making you an indentured slave, a beneficiary status to here, it's the in God we trust. And actually, to tie back to what I began saying, the in God we trust is the umbrella for the entire world, because from Babylon to Persia, from Persia to Greece, and from Greece to Rome, and Rome becoming expressed in the Catholic Church and the Vatican, and that being usurped by the British and becoming the financial district of London, it eventually becomes the United States of America, headquartered in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. They still have their office. Like I'll keep saying, it's 78 Seabird Street, Philadelphia. So effectively, when you are now able to be brought into court and handled there because you are in a contract with the in God we trust. And now that's an umbrella for every so-called country. So getting back, so I'm coherent with this, cogent, there are no privileges that a group gains by having an excess of individuals around. There's only the privileges vested in the individual. So we found out that no individual anywhere in the world can own land, property, aka buildings, vehicles, money, or material objects. You can only be a managerial steward, which is, I have this, it is uncontested by somebody else, therefore I am having the disposition to be a good steward, a good manager of this object, of this land. Originally, a land was carried out by allodial title, which is nobody was here. I walked up upon it. I'm taking care of it. I'm here until I'm not here. We'll get back to that in a minute. So I don't lose track about these countries which don't exist. I'm revealing so this actually comes back to your West and East question, because we're dealing with fundamental things that people call spiritual, but they're more like mental code assigned values. Like, again, going back to writing that web page, seeing the web page, writing these genes, epigenetics, what's going on with the genetic cult behind the scenes. People think of some woo-woo ufology, aliens, spiritual. No. This is dealing with the flesh, the material, and the minds and the mental, and being very advanced in the mental space and understanding that the physical is a little different than how I described it as purely being mental. It's sort of a bridge of chemical, this chemical bridge that moves between pure mental world, and the physical would technically be these chemicals. And that's how they got away with sort of putting the spin on our vernacular. Physical really describes chemical electromomentum between the mental world and its building, like we see through ribonucleic acid, these sequences into our world. Physical really describes this bridge going from the manifestation of the mental into the chemical that then builds what we experience as the material. So that being side-spaced for a minute, point being, the only thing you can own as a human being, because they can consent and contract. And again, don't be owned and don't go owning anybody. We're just describing dynamics of ability. It's not actually allowed. Don't do it. It's violence in natural law, but it's the only thing you can, which is to bring elucidation to the fact that you cannot own any building. You cannot own land property or anything, the animals and the trees on it and the critters or whatever, oceans, etc., all contained in that. You can't own money. You can't own vehicles, and you can't own material objects. You're just the managing steward. Now, taking a little bit circuitously redundifying that, but the point of doing that is to get clarity on the fact. I see our timer up there. Oh boy. Hold on a second.
10 minutes.
I had the prior meeting just finish. Okay. Anyway, so to bring that through is to elucidate and clarify the fact about countries. That you could bring a bunch of individuals together and they're suggesting that there's a boundary and this is ours. This is us. Literally, we'll go here. We're us. We're the US. That's not real. What we actually have is far more fascinating. We have a nudge, wink, wink agreement amongst bankers. Now, I know a lot of people from John Lennon's Imagine, the lyrics, imagine, there's no countries. Philosophically, we get this. Tactilely, we believe this. But I'm saying technically and formally. So there's a wink, wink, nudge, nudge agreement. Everybody's got some form of a trust and some form of a birth certificate. If it's got different names and a slightly different shape of this fiscal instrument, everybody's got this formula across the world now. And that is, so to say, here's France, here's Germany, here's South Africa, here's Zimbabwe, they're all saying, okay, we bankers here, we'll own the humans up to here. But it's just because the bankers next door in Algeria are saying, okay, just because the bankers next door in Poland are saying, okay, we won't document the sheep over there. Whoever documents them to their banking institution through a trust and making them beneficiaries is who has status on the death certification and the birth certification as livestock, as chattel. But the way they're doing it, and many have revealed this, but having full revelation come forward, they're doing it by beneficial status in a trust. Once you discover this and what kind of trusts they're all working with, you realize something was just out of view that this individual calibrated for us, I believe through the higher power, brought it in through him as a vessel. And there's an ability to merge common law and ecclesiastical law. And then we have ecclesiastical's canon law. So the best bar trained lawyers are trained in canon law. It's a rare, high training that everything begins in the Bible. For most of the modern world, starts with the Christian Bible, or the Torah. Usually it goes all the way back to the 5 books, usually centered around Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, but centered around the central 3. Exodus, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy, and actually less numbers. Actually, these 3. It's centered around Exodus, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy. These very law-oriented books, which are mostly about tort. And if you do something, be followed to your brother or sister, it's individual. What is your restitution amount? It deals a lot. That comes into the Jewish Talmud. And Jewish Talmud, as expounded by the more academic, secular minds, that comes forward as the British Magna Carta. And as soon as the British Magna Carta brings this forward, it informs most of the constitutions of the modern world by canon law, or the canon of the Bible. So the closest one we would say from here, approximated, is Switzerland. You have a canon law court, ecclesiasticus, the law of congregations, of church, canon. So now the law of the land is common law, which is, do no harm, take no offense. Or we said the apophatic, what you don't like, don't do to people. But it means, strictly speaking, in natural law, the only individual who's violent is the initiation of harm. This is lost to the modern world to such a tune that we're like in we're in real Twilight Zone land with this. And we have these terrible phrases we said colloquially from who knows how long, at least the 60s forward. It takes 2. Parents who say it takes 2. No, it doesn't. There's always an initiator. Only the initiation of injury is violent. That's a violation of the space of the individual. And the individual whose space was violated has full allowance to respond with as much force as required to discontinue the violation to themselves. That's what happens to every squirrel and every cat and lion and elephant and hippo and rhino. The only thing that is violence is the individual who initiated penetrating the safe space around the individual. We've been combining the term aggression and violence. Force and aggression is a utility. Violence is singularly the individual who initiates harm. And that's important. That's important to this discussion of how these things get in motion. We have to look at that, you know. So we're saying in terms of countries that, well, they're not. There's a bunch of bankers who have corralled individuals into consent and contract or trickery. Now we're talking about common law. Common law is the law of the land. It's the common law. What you dislike, do not do to somebody else. Like, probably don't trick people into enslaving themselves. So this is a combination of the trust that we use of common law and ecclesiastical law. So it's a common law, irrevocable ecclesiastical trust, which I went around saying all that. It's got a little thin there, but I'm saying it to say this trust actually is superior to the in God we trust and the trusts that these so-called countries, we'd better call them nations. And what we've just clarified is a nation is a covenant in trust. So you, the individual, can do anything they do. Once you find this out, you go make your own trust. And when you make your own trust, it's direct to the higher power. And now you're using Black's Law Dictionary to gain this, and you're working in common law, irrevocable ecclesiastical trust. That's superior to theirs. So now, if you don't cause a victim, if you don't cause injury to anybody still in their trust, none of that stuff actually touches you. So this was to say, this is a big thing that we're teaching and we're discovering, and I'm expanding upon it because I know the thing that the guy who started the work didn't get because of his dogmatic limitations is that we're building the common law ecclesiastical court, because that's what's stopping there being the enforcement. And this might be the equivalent of what the Bible calls the kingdom of Christ come on earth, because it's a judicial standard of what I just said. It's restoring this natural law principle in an enforceable way, which most of the more anarchical leaning natural law people limit themselves from getting, that there has to be an officiation, but it has to be done with this metric, that only the individual who initiates violence is the individual who is the harming individual, not the response. The response to that is a response to that. That's basically, in colloquial speech, self-defense. Now we can take that to a different level and look at it as what we call psychic violence, where things begin in the level of the mind. See, it sounds like I'm jumping around, but it's always going to come back to understanding, reformulating fundamental grasp of what we're calling spiritual or common, mundane. We're dealing now, there's a level of the mind where you're planning things. Now we've extended this a little bit in sci-fi and Hollywood into the thought crime or pre-crime, famously Minority Report. You know, but we're really, really wanting to get down with the individuals to what's in your mind. Because if we trace an electrical signal, we learn that all inventions, it's not just the New Ages, your thoughts are not your thoughts, don't be egotistical about it, don't be so identity invested. No, somebody actually came up with a thing. And if the thing is positive, of benefit, it's an origin point of some kind of cultivation of love or kindness or care, okay, you get credit for that. It's a meritocracy inside the world of the mental. It's a coining of something. And if you did something nasty and you were the origin point of that, well, we might find you more criminal than, well, it landed on a vulnerable individual and their hands did a thing. But we find out somebody who doesn't even do much action-based nastiness in the world, their mind scammed this up and they were able to project it out. So we're going to enter into a whole new level of exposing and making transparent the world of the mind. I realize where we are. If you want to stop,
no problem.
We have less than a minute.
We
can come back in. I'm happy to come back in again. We just have less than a minute up.
Yeah, less than a minute. I'll send you that, and then because
please let's pick it up. Okay, all right, you got it. Well,
yes, so good. We're back for part 3. So yes, unfortunately, I do. It's pretty late this side. It's almost 3 in the morning, so I have to just mind the noise for family. So I think we're gonna have to try maybe summarize in this third part. But I think it'll be really good to have you on again for another podcast interview entirely, because I think it's just breaking down. There are a lot of many dimensions that you're sharing, and I feel like it'll be a disservice to try kind of get you to, you just break it part by part. If that's something that's okay with you, obviously.
Fine with me. Yeah.
But yeah, no, I had it over.
As they say now, in this age, I'm here for it.
Yes, no, vice versa, brother. But I hand it over to you, and you can continue.
You're good. You're recording. Good to go?
Yes, I'm perfectly good.
So what we're saying here, so it's getting into the trust, getting into these aspects of ownership, and just breaking down that a country, better called a nation, is really a trust of some formula. And to get out of that, you establish yourself as a trust. Anything they can do, you can do, and you can do it better. So simply put. So that is all. I brought all that in to say that is an aspect of how we are obtaining land and property is through this trust. We're understanding the nefarious activities, to put it in United States terms, because it's the ones I know and I'm working with. The IRS is just a bunch of individuals doing what any individual can do. And so you can do it too, and you can do it better. And so when they foreclose, and due to our limited opportunity to speak here now, I'll just keep it concise. To do what they do with foreclosures, they're actually doing it illicitly. It's a compound process of a false coupling of the mortgage, the title. Titles were essentially a deed to a title, essentially deals like a home room pass, if you will. People are familiar with that outside the US. It's like the style of a home room pass, like yeah, I could walk myself to the bathroom. Thank you. But now you got a home room pass, a bathroom pass. They gave a pass, like a system. It was adopted effectively. And we got into this deed to a title, and they stapled a mortgage to it. Mortgage effectively is complete and utter fraud. And they stapled that to the title, which was like, okay, you could use this system, pass a torch on the original Lodial title. I'm here because I'm here. Anyway, we'll get into this hopefully at a different podcast to break all that down step by step. The illicit illicit things going on there, and some of it was introduced by suggestion, allegation, assertion. People adopted it. Some of it's just completely, it doesn't matter who adopts it, it's just completely fraudulent. But there isn't the space to fully unpack that now. But using these processes is one way that we're obtaining land, because technically they can't do the foreclosures they do. It's a complete and utter lie. But you need to be in a trust of this kind to protect yourself from being treated as chattel, and to be able to stand in the power that you naturally should have had and your parents inattentively gave away. But that's one more aspect of why this is so effective and so easy to recontract yourself, is because you didn't actually sign the contract. Your parents were deceived implicitly into doing it. And then when you look at parental guardianship, that's not implicit in nature. So we've got twofold weakness, that you did not yourself sign this. And besides, even in effect of your parents signing it, that's not in nature. Somebody just decided parental guardianship is a thing. That's not implicit. It's another thing as a magical spell. It's got rhythm and momentum, and people adopted it. So okay, it's got some, it's got some hold on the world.
I have one question. I have one question on that point. So yes, but then how else? And I know I don't want to sound really weird, but how else do you regulate human activity? I mean, if there's
that's a great question.
Crack
back through your fundamental questions. So all that to say, what are we doing now? We're doing that. We're using the trust to get access to these communities, the land, which will be being held in the trust, and part of this new society being monitored through trust and in trust, literally in all aspects. For a succinct, concise way of putting it, and I'm not in anybody's ism, I'm not in anybody's ick, I'm not in anybody's model, but it's known colloquially, the Christians say there's this all debts paid guy. One way to quickly put it, I'm not on anybody's team here. I've gone through all the different systems, but that's the most known. All debts are paid by this certain individual.
Yes.
Their way of putting it. So
Yes.
if we say all debts are paid, how do you have these in their world? We're just going to go with this one for succinct sake, because I could put it in the Hindu way, I could put it in the Jewish way, I could put it in the Muslim and Buddhist way, I could put it in everybody's way. In the Shinto way, I could put it in the Confucian Taoist way, I could put it in everybody's way. But the one that's most known, probably to the greatest universal audience, even if they're secular, is the Christian way. So how are all these Christians walking around with a compartmentalization in their head? And they say all debts are paid except I owe Toyota of, Columbia, South Carolina for my truck. Do you? I owe Columbia University of New York. Do you? Because either on this hand, you got this hand where all debts are paid. So you don't have a different spiritual, you don't have a different internal language than you can financial language. Who's tricking you with all this vernacular? If all debts are paid, all debts are paid. And then on this hand, you could say, well, if I'm an indentured slave, bonded as the beneficiary of these people's trust, dude, I'm a slave. I can't incur debt. Take care of me. I'm your household object. So either I emancipated myself, I have a trust. So why are you giving me debt if I haven't caused you injury? Or I'm a beneficiary in your trust that you're calling a citizen and I'm effectively your property. So how could I have debt if I'm your household object slave? So debt doesn't make any sense. We're completely tricked into a worldwide economic forum that is wildly misleading in all its vernacular and description, and we need to break out of that, like just the local matrix of these ideas before we get into an etheric matrix, leave it of the mind and the mental space, never mind approximating what people believe is energy or spirit. So that is to say, one of the things. So again, I'm heavily into music. Always have been since I was a child, 3 years old, playing the piano. And around the same, can remember being 2 and 3 and going out with my father to the garden, and did that through right up into my teens, and took a much more focused interest in that about 10 years ago as an adult, as I started to look into what's really going on in the world with GMOs and organic food, and why food security is such an important matter for every individual to take into themselves and their
100%.
community, and the need to build these communities and have food security in these communities, and building these communities, and looking at the aspects of jurisdiction in general, law in general, trust, and having trust in ourselves, and understanding that trust means trust and means financial trust, but it's like trust, and that this also means debt, and the debt's paid, like all debt and inward debt, and looking at the psychological steps of forgiving ourselves, forgiving through all this, and moving out of the guilt and shame and blame models, and understanding that responsibility is the proactive force that mobilizes us into the ability to harmonize and make connections and move forward in this mental space, and to advance into the new society in an effective way that many have wanted, and many go communist, fascistic, and they make all the wrong turns. But we have a pretty good attache of the wrong turns that have been made, that I'm pretty sure if we use the open forums, the open spaces that we have now, we can move into the we can move into a good way. So essentially, breaking down what our little group is effectively doing now, and we'd like to recruit bigger numbers, is to go to the cities where there are these silly universities and establish schools that actually unlearn and unravel nonsense and bring holistic information back, what used to be called effectively the mystery schools, the magical schools. And just to be blunt, they're far more important for men, because men have a big problem. Men have a very big problem that's affecting the world, and it's a biological problem. In that there's an artery here, and it will tie together your question about the East and West, because the ultimate East and West is here, the left and right hemispheres of the brain, and we do know in more advanced neurobiology that it's not so simple as the reductive way of saying that. I'm well aware of that, but putting it into hard and fast black and white terms of, say, 30 years ago at least, it's simpler to begin to tackle the material. The left brain deals with this alchemically masculine, archetypally masculine, linear processing and detail-oriented, spatially aware aspects of things, and the right brain is far more associative and intuitive, loosely put. So there's a matter about the male brain that's anatomical. There's a artery that does not open. very, at best, it's not going to naturally open till 40, more like 60 or not. So this
Wow.
is one aspect of why grandpa sort of, so to speak, softens. But there are ways, sequences to take that software, that psychological aspect of the interior mind as it sits in the brain here, and move it through an initiation that forces that artery to open and cross the hemispheres. Now, this is not the situation with little girls. Little girls, when they're 4 years old, this artery naturally opens. And they have cross flow across the hemispheres, why little girls naturally begin to pick up social cues. And the fact that this is controversial or cuts against a modern narrative, it's just trash. I just don't have any use for unscientific, non-neurobiological information. It's just wrong. So there is this artery opens for little girls, and that's why they're more social. They have more communication ability, and they're able to pick up on social cues better, and why they operate on that lens. And they'd rather stay on that side of the brain, on the so-called right hemisphere, than operate on. So men become far more powerful and far more accessible to females when they open their right brain. You could do this at 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16 years old if you're being taken through the steps transmitted from an authentic teacher. But the thing is, you don't usually just fall into this by yourself. And again, in the modern world, we've lost this lineage teaching. Everybody's the boss of themselves. But the reality is, this is a signal. This is a neuroelectric, been back to that frequency of electromagnetics. This is a transmitted signal from teacher to student that goes through, and the different authentic wisdom systems of the world, the big ones and the small ones, they all have their own package, they all have their own frame, but essentially they're going through a mystical or magical, it's really all psychological. All this is sort of not to be sacrosanct or irreverent, but it's mumbo jumbo for the fact that it's a psychological sequencing that opens this artery and crosses the hemispheres in men. And then men are able to use the right brain properly assigned to the left brain and do more in that way. So that's something that's missing. So we'd like these schools, especially for men, to come back and do this initiation. It would be very beneficial for society to have, be beneficial for women to have men on this level actually being able to. So that's one thing. In the cities, we were going to be chartering these schools. And then in the rural areas, we're starting these communities that are going to be doing this rewilding to some degree of learning to be connected to the process of growing. And really, that's just fuel to be together and produce this renovating of society back to a connected place. Those are the big things we're doing. I still play a lot of music. I'm still very musically involved. We're looking at picking up some spaces and doing things like shows and in spaces. Right now, we're most centrally located in Savannah, between Savannah, Georgia, Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, Columbia, South Carolina, Asheville, North Carolina, Virginia Beach, Virginia, and a little bit in Chattanooga, Tennessee. But that's kind of our nexus at the moment, that we're working on these particular areas. And myself, I was born and currently I'm sitting in central Connecticut.
Okay. That's upper north. That's north, right?
Yeah, it's near New York. I'm sitting an hour presently outside of New York City, to put it on the map, But I've been living in the Southeast for the past 8.5 years. I should have said the two big ones we're working in too is Atlanta, Georgia, and Charlotte, North Carolina, arguably the two seats of the Southeast. But I've been primarily working down in the Southeast for the last 8.5 years, and formerly all over Florida. But essentially the five Southeast states: Florida, Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, Tennessee, and a little bit Alabama and Virginia. So we're down there. If I said that too fast and left something out, yes, I did.
No,
but
no,
I'm feeling the pressure. I'm feeling the pressure of our time constraint now, and I just want to wrap this up before you said that. But when you ask about the dichotomy of the East and West, the literal geographic East and their wisdom and their traditions are, loosely put, the right brain, if you will, the more intuitive, feminine, circle sort of associations, and in the Western traditions, the more liminal or more masculine left brain. Again, this is reductive, but it's reductive generalization for the sake of getting into the conversation and being able to dialogue and approach it. So yeah, so the real East and West is sitting here in our skulls. It's bridging the East and West, and what sits in the center is the corpus callosum, veritable movie theater inside your brain, which your occipital, your optical cortex in the back is literally viewing this information. The corpus. It's very interesting. You stick out your eye and say, depth perception. It's almost a complete fabrication, because you can't ever actually. This gets into a very deep psychological orientation or perception out of solipsism notion, because you stretch out your arm, however tall you are, 2.5 feet to 4 feet, however tall you are, 3 feet average, whatever. You stick out your arm and say, well, that's 3 feet away. Well, what am I basing my sense of reality on? Probably, if you're not blind, mostly your eyes predominate everything, and then touch comes next, hearing and smell after, taste less so. But, it's pretty confirming if you do put your tongue on something or something on your tongue. But we start usually this visual tactile thing and say, well, here's I can prove the sense of the outside world. I can attain the external world because I can touch it. It's like, yeah, okay. Well, you're not actually experiencing those stimulus sensations at the place where you believe it's happening. The strongest proof of that is, even if we use the body model as if the body was there and not just some atomic representation, you say, oh, well, it's happening in my optical cortex in the back of my head. That's where I'm actually composing the stimulus received, and then I'm forming an image of that that's projected into the corpus callosum in the skull. Okay, so you stick your hand out 3 feet and say 3 feet out there. Yeah, but the whole orientation of the space that composes that 3 feet, you're organizing that idea inside your optical cortex in your occipital lobe. So you never actually attain the external world. You can't even prove that. We're not holographically just sharing stimulus-based reality compounded together, which is what we are in a frequency-based electromagnetic state. Now, the thing is that because we're all working on this together as a shared organism, like mycelium in that sense, yeah, we have definite values. So the thing, to put it in an old philosophical framework this is mentioned in, you say, and I'm going to step it up one, but the point is, you say, oh, hues of color. Yeah. Say your blue hue, when you see, so blue, let's say it has a fixed value, make something up, 292 pixelation, blue, that's a fundamental value. So you see what we're going to just allegedly put is 292. You see 292 hertz frequency color, yeah, and you go blue or whatever, azul, whatever your language is, because you've learned to assign a sound to a hue.
Yeah.
But technically, beyond that hue, you're seeing a fixed value. So as long as every time you see 292, you say blue or your vicinity's equivalent language consistently, then you and I are going to relate just fine. We're not in schizophrenia. We're not out of sync, because the pixelation 292 hit the receptor eye, went to the oxygen, and said, oh, blue. That's blue. The sky's blue. But I don't know, and this is classical philosophical framework, I don't know that your hue of blue is mine. My assigned hue might be your assigned red, but the thing is, we come into concordance, we come into alignment and agreement and coherence as long as I'm consistent. Every time the value pixelation 292 hits me, I always say blue, and you always say blue or your equivalent. Then we're all fine. We're all jiving. But I don't know what you could jump into my parameter, if you will, if you could, and go, and you could maintain the idea of what your parameter was a second ago before you jump in there. That's highly theoretical. But if you could, you could say, oh, wow, my red hue is your blue hue, and your purple hue is my yellow hue. And that's just one level. But I'd raise it a level and say, now you're out in you're seeing an ostrich. But I don't know that your schematic of ostrich isn't my schematic of elephant. But if we give an ostrich a value of 1100, 1962, as long as when you see 1962, you say ostrich or your vicinity's equivalent language, who cares? We're in coherence. We're in alignment. But I don't know if you were to jump in my skull and you go, whoa, Z, your ostrich looks like my elephant. We don't know that our whole composite schematic is jigged up the same way. We don't know. And it really doesn't really fundamentally matter as long as we maintained equivalency of consistency that when I see 1962, I go, ostrich. You go, ostrich. You go, whoa, your ostrich looks like a river. And me. So we don't know how this thing is assembled on the back end. That's really curious. So we start to advance in these places of the mind, and that's kind of anyway. So that these are things we are doing, and these, we want to have these schools, we want to have these pieces of land that we're taking, that we're learning to work together to clean the mind and come from an authentic space. But getting back before that is really talking about our origin story, or a mathematically and holistically conceptually provable point that blows all the religions and wisdom systems just away, just blows them away, gets rid of their lies and obfuscations, and starts from a point of origin and walks it forward, because all these guys seem to come from the human level, and convenience and ego and impression-based misconception gets in there. If we mathematically can come to an agreement about a singular point, which we could talk about in the future, that it seems that there's a tremendous amount of agreement. Anybody who's using cognitive reason, whether from a religious wisdom system based perspective, or from it was Aristotle or these purist philosophers of Greece and said areas, or whether it's wisdom systems or even science talking about the super compressed thought of the Big Bang. I know there's modified string theories now, but we look at this general colloquialism using cognitive reason that we come from a singular point. You can see when you enter into this from the holistic point of cognitive reason, we see that each thing in the world now has a process. That's a process of making a garment, whether it's more fundamental, implicitly things like berry comes out of a tree or a vine. Everything comes out of something. The baby subdivides from. We can rewind until we get back to a single point. And everybody who's using cognitive reason can agree on that fact. Science may strip away of anything more than it being that compressed point of sort of a void, but everybody can say everything's got to come from a single point. Where'd that come from? Stop, you missed the assignment. Where'd that come from? Stop, you missed the assignment. Cognitive reason says there has to be a stopping point at which everything was compressed, the everything dot, if you will. We could talk about that, but understanding that and fundamentally standing on that, if you can't come to that point of conjunction, if that point of concurrence in accord, you're not in the conversation. You're frankly an idiot. You don't even deserve to have this conversation, because anybody can see that in the observable world, everything comes out of something, and all we have to do is rewind back, and there's going to be an original something. That's the same. Now we can dialogue all forever for the rest of, we have breath too, about the nature of that everything. What it's going to do and what's going to happen next. But if you can't get back there, you're just not in this conversation. Go kick rocks, as they say. Well, don't. I don't know if they want you to. But and that gets to the heart of this, is coming forward from that dot. We start to grasp that this is fundamentally from our origin point about violence versus the allowance versus ability, and the nature of force versus violence. And this is going to come into the perspective of what a strange cultivation that happens in here mathematically by consequence of force of this development. That's clearly, you could track the holistic steps of what we call God, what this master thing really is, and why it's not what might be called the creator. It's not the higher power. It's certainly not our point of singular origin. We'd have to talk about all that in effective psychological language, in places that we can find universal agreement, in places that I might be able to maturely and better articulate down to a third grade level than maybe anybody living. Might sound boastful, but I've kind of been around a little bit, and I've found good ways to take everybody's material and put it forward. So I am sitting near New York City currently, and I'm from about 40 minutes from here in very central Connecticut. If anybody's ever heard of probably the most famous sports network in the world, arguably, certainly in the United States, it's ESPN.
No.
They're the only thing that is of any nominal mention in my hometown of Bristol, Connecticut. So I grew up there, and my father grew up with Catholicism around himself, and when he strayed from that and decided he was curious about what the world was, he went back to that and said to a priest that he was seeing there, said, I'd like for my wife to be doing something spiritual. It seems appropriate. He said, well, what's the problem? Bring her to mass. And well, her family's very Jewish, culturally, not religiously so much, and they wouldn't like it. So he said this was the 80s and they were beginning to be ecumenical and they were getting trained in sociology and psychology. And he said, so it's the same God, just send her to synagogue. And so my father's curiosity about anything internal and so-called spiritual or, religious or whatever brought him back to Catholic Church, which is all he knew as a child. After the sort of being part of a difficult biker gang that became an above board activist club, and he went back to the Catholic Church and just got a priest to tell him to say this to my mother. My mother went back to a very basic conservative synagogue, and that got my grandmother, my grandfather, my aunts, all of them went back to synagogue because my dad went to a Catholic church because he became curious about. So I had those two lines running. My father was highly ambitious and motivated to keep seeking. It was this, and he kept expanding his library larger and larger, researching the Catholic Church, decided what many do, that it was an imposition of the Church of Rome that ultimately culminated in Emperor Constantine, taking aspects of this newly emergent phenomena of a few hundred years out of Israel and combining it with many pagan, and by pagan I don't mean what people call pagan today. Usually they assign the word pagan to the nature magic cultures of Europe. But in the time of the Apostle Paul, what they were referring to as pagans were Asia Minor, which were much more antiquous stories of Zoroastrianism, Mithraism, this world religion, which could be broken down further because it is important to see it clearly for what it is, because it definitely influences a lot of modern culture, politic, and what's going on with the youth, as they say. This is a return of paganism, but they didn't know, and they don't know to associate it with that. But we'd like to get it back there so people can understand some core psychological human dynamics and how the actual New Testament model of Christ, which has nothing to do with the church, because the church is, well, bluntly put, built on the most satanic disciple, Peter, who the Christ said, that man or woman or whoever that was said, you will deny me 3 times, and on the satanic rock you will build an organization that will deny, deceive, and fool the world. So a lot of Christians probably don't want to hear this, and I don't really care. They need to hear this. Also, even just basing it on an academic look at the New Testament, none of the disciples are on the list of 72 apostles. Curious fact. Paul was an apostle. Peter, James, John, those guys weren't listed as the 72 apostles. So those 12, they might have been on discipline. They might have been closely watched because they were a little naughty and prone to mischief and doing funny things. So they were the disciples because they were heavily under disciplinary watch. And so Peter, being the worst of them all, playing into a treachery with, I'll just say it here, with Jesus. It's a curious name, as well as twin Simon, who carried the cross and then played a little game with Peter, and now he got this church. Anyway, so
I wouldn't be. I'm definitely not qualified in many matters. In that
I'm going into a lot of avenues of getting back to what we call natural law, which is the bringing it back to the words of Christ. Everything is there that's important. Looking at these as systems from the outside, not giving them the religious context, understanding that the great teachers all had important messages, and their messages are all pretty much the same, and they all have to do with not doing violence. And so we're looking at it from that perspective, that the information is there. But so anyway, this is the place that I came from, are these two sides. And he was seeing that there's been a fundamental overlay of what's called the church back to Constantine's time. We have this pagan message that's been imposed there. We're attempting to restore clarity of this message. And when you context it back to understanding what that message was that they were working to overcome, then you'll see how it ended up where it is and how we can hopefully bring it back to a place that's helpful to every believer in faith of every kind and understanding what the real message really was and why it's a genuinely universal message and of great importance, and why we can actually reduce it down to mathematical certainty of how we can work together to bring about the best future for humanity, or what we would call the soul. But again, we're not trying to be controversial. It's only controversial for the ego invested misunderstandings and ignorance about the information. So I'd like to kind of burst all those bubbles and bring the mind into the presence of what's really being said, so we can find the universal place where it's harmonized and we can see the things that are genuinely correct from these things, and then we're the system, if you will, overlaid misinformation to keep us apart. The only goal is to bring ourselves together, and sometimes we need to be a little controversial in order to see how we've been deceived and kept apart from each other. Basically, that's all I'm doing. I happen to know that one really well, because what happened is, as I grew through, I was mostly going around these conservative synagogues and Jewish environments. That's where we were sent with my mom's family. And then eventually the two came together. And that's sort of getting into that quickly into my backstory. I ended up in what's called Hebrew Christianity or Messianic Judaism, when my mom's family and us children kind of disconnected more for power, monetary, political reasons, not religious reasons. But it was a point in my father's discovery and learning where it all sort of came together. We left the Catholic Church, went to the typical Bible-believing evangelical, non-denominational, and then went further from that. Never really rejected that, but even now he still hangs around there. But he got deeper into Hebrew roots, and our family congealed around going to the Hebrew Christian, Messianic Jewish sectors. And the particular vicinity of that we landed in was some really hard-hitting academics. So in my teen years, that's where I landed. Once I got over the shock of this transfer, I started opening up, and one of our first really good teachers was talking about the book of Daniel and looking at it from a very historical perspective, a carbon dated perspective. There were just things in there that were like hard to avoid. The tremendousness of it, of a student of history. And I was 15, and I was looking at this and going, okay, that's pretty profound. I'm going to pay more attention to this. So that got me looking through the material. I started hanging out a little more at the youth group in my father's local, regular evangelical church. And they had like an energy, they had an emotion, they had an enthusiasm and a passion that was missing a little bit in the more academic areas where I was. But the two together really moved me forward. I went to a big youth revival, and it really turned something on that I would see as more now glandular systems, using harmonics and music and waking up the system. They want to see their fundamentalism, but I see the operative mechanics, and I'm not reducing, I'm not speaking down on them. We're just identifying what they are, and maybe they're being used a little bit as a grift and then an assigned to the fundamentalism, but they are useful to turning on the human mind. And so it did, and their particular expression was that, and I was hanging around them more. So I started looking at Paul's epistles quite a bit, and they really had a certain way of communicating to the human mind and the Gospels, and I started poring over and over them and went through them many, many times and wrote little essays on them. And I decided as I started my senior year that I was carrying around a big book, and I went back and read it from the beginning, from Genesis forward, and got through the Old Testament, as it's so-called, numerous times. And that made me ask a lot of questions, and I ended up going to an Orthodox Jewish rabbi who was connected to our family, and it kept growing. I self-taught autodidact Hebrew, took a prayer book, and taught myself the English versions of all the prayers traditionally laid down in their version of things, and learned it pretty quickly, and then taught myself the Old Testament in Hebrew in the next year. And about a year and a half later, I ended up in Israel and was studying in their equivalent of seminary or yeshiva there. It's a very long and colorful story with a lot of sort of paranatural terms. They kept opening sort of portals, if you will. Everywhere I went, it was very surrendered, very open. And the more I did that, the more grace, you could call it, was being shown. And everywhere I went, things that should have been reserved for a far more advanced individual were just being given, because my heart was very open. I had a very powerful mind, very keen intellect, but I was always coming from the surrendered space of my heart and being very vulnerable. Like, I really, 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 really am very concerned about my eternal destiny, about our collective eternal destiny, about what's factually, absolutely, definitely real. What can we touch? What can we say? What can we figure out? So I was in a very vulnerable, sensitive, open, introverted, introspective, very inward state. And I guess it was to such a degree that I kept getting gifts. I kept getting grace. I kept getting things handed to me. So I went through that system, and with the entire Talmud I had gone through in about 3 years. I did things that people don't do usually, even if they start in this system in their life. Some, advanced people do. I did it very fast, very fast. Before I switched gears, I had read about My father was perusing. He was a skimmer. He liked to collect all these books and put them in his library, and they kept getting more and more. And when I was in my senior year in high school and just after, I read basically all of them. Very good reader, very voracious reader. Read about 500 books, self-taught autodidact, taught in the Koine Greek, went through older manuscripts of the Koine Greek. I just had to know. And I kept feeling the spirit and this graced energy was always assisting me because I was coming from the place of a heart that I just have to know. I see our timer, so just to give the quick wrap up, we could expand more. Whatever
No
you like,
problem,
whatever you want.
go ahead,
And
man. Don't
you know,
remind me.
this led me through their whole system. I was around what you would call in that system Kabbalists. I wasn't directly learning Kabbalah then, but osmotically, I was getting the energy of everybody. We really talk about this place in B'nai B'rak so much more and what it was to be there then. So I went through that whole system. I ended up having quite profound experiences. I could do just about 5 talks just on being there in that environment. Ended up back in the States and I defragged myself from that, came out of it, saw glitches and things that were out of sync with that. And, you know, I came out of that and ended up back here in the States, went to go back because I skipped the traditional college years, being 4 years over there in Israel. And I was working adjunct at Tel Aviv at Bar Ilan, taking classes in quantum mechanics while I was learning the essential Kabbalistic gears and dynamics from their point of perspective. But I wasn't formally matriculated until I came back and went to regular school here. But it didn't really take. And instead, I just kept finding musicians and doing what I really always felt passionate about. Picked up my guitar, started singing, writing music, ended up developing a very large group of people between up here in the north, Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, New York, New Jersey was our main area that we were going around playing everything from open mics to big shows. And anyway, it was a whole network of people. It was a whole lot going on. This is back in the early 2000s, if you will. And a lot of that led to people being interested in us in the spiritual, sort of pseudo spiritual phenomena, psychological phenomena, social experiments breaking out around us, and about 5 colleges that we were loosely connected to. We had we tested. We had ways of testing our sphere of influence, and we saw from our 10 individual group really at our core to the hundreds that were at our parties or parties that we would go to, adjacent music festivals, schools. Probably was about a 5,000 to 10,000 individual reach with our little signature experiments we were doing. They took a big toll on me though, and I ended up retreating from society by 2005. And I did something very interesting, and I was led there by my neurology being so worn out from hitting reality so hard. I should say in between there, I had privilege at Wesleyan University in Middletown, Connecticut. At that time in 2002, 2003, there was a Geshe Lab Singh Gompo, is third to the Dalai Lama. Well, his Rinpoche, who was there with him, was. And we were learning the Buddhist sutras direct from third to the Dalai Lama with his Chinese translated staff. So that was very interesting. So I got open access. So we only have 1 minute.
Yeah, no,
So
actually,
I tried to run really quickly and connect my backstory, spirituality, East and West, and the dualistic nature of the world in general, and understanding what we can agree on and why what we disagree on can be brought closer to harmonization and agreement through synchronous, synthesis of all these systems.
We need to have you on again. See, that's all I can say. We need to have you on again, and I really appreciate you.
Sure.
Yeah, we just need to have you on again, and definitely, I think people can learn a lot from just these conversations and what you shared. It's been really profound. Some controversies here and there, but it's life. People take it how they must. But it definitely
controversies are always going to exist. It's more interesting is exploring the dynamics of the controversy themselves
and everything. I don't know what's convenient
for you. Should we grab another link here?
Yeah, I was actually going to send you another link via email, and then we'll continue so that because it's very interesting what you're going into. And let me send you the link on email. Just give me 1 minute. 1 minute.